Welcome, everyone, to the channel where dark secrets, hidden desires, and spine-chilling mysteries come to life. We are your guide through the twists and turns of one of the most thrilling psychological dramas yet. A gloomy, isolated mansion, a young woman trapped in a loveless marriage, and a mysterious stranger who enters her life just as everything begins to spiral out of control. This is a story of passion, betrayal, and the haunting impact of a past that refuses to stay buried. If you're drawn to suspense, unforgettable characters, and a plot that'll keep you guessing at every turn, you're in the right place. Subscribe, hit the bell to stay up to date, and prepare yourself for Lover in the Attic. Together, we'll uncover secrets that may have been better left in the dark. The town of Shady Pines sat tucked away from the main roads, just beyond where the coastal cliffs met the sprawling, mist-covered fields. It was a small, forgotten town that seemed untouched by time, where the salt from the sea clung to the wind and whispers lingered in the fog. Its streets were narrow and winding, flanked by old Victorian houses that leaned like weary secrets. At night, the town took on an otherworldly stillness, broken only by the occasional call of a distant owl or the far-off crashing of waves against the rocks. On the edge of Shady Pines, perched atop a small hill that overlooked the cliffs, was the mansion where Emily Hartman lived with her husband Richard. The house had been standing for over a century, its dark wooden walls sagging under the weight of its own history. Heavy twisted vines clawed up its side, giving the mansion a foreboding look that kept most visitors at a distance. The garden, once a grand sight in its prime, was now overgrown with weeds and shadowed by the looming trees. And then, there was the attic, a forgotten room under the house's pitched roof, with creaky floorboards and dim, flickering light bulbs. Emily and Richard had moved to Shady Pines 3 years ago, hoping the quiet would soothe some of the tension in their marriage. They had been together 7 years by now. Their once passionate romance had withered into routine, a cold silence that filled the spaces between them. Richard was a man of few words, his temper hidden behind a wall of formality. He provided for Emily, gave her everything she could want, everything but his affection. It was September 6th, 2023, when she first noticed the moving truck next door. The property had been vacant for years, its windows dark and shuttered, but now it was suddenly alive with activity. Emily had been tending to her neglected garden, absent-mindedly pulling at the weeds that choked the roses, when she saw him, a man with dark, tousled hair and an easy, confident stance. He was helping the movers unload boxes, directing them with a kind of quiet authority. Emily paused, watching him from the shadows of her own overgrown yard. He must have sensed her gaze, because he turned, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, a strange, charged silence hanging between them. His face was ruggedly handsome, his eyes piercing and deep, as if they held a story he wasn't ready to share. Emily felt a warmth creeping up her cheeks, and quickly looked away, embarrassed by her own curiosity. Later that evening, as the light began to fade and the mist thickened over the garden, Emily found herself wandering outside once more. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, but there he was, standing at the edge of her garden, as if waiting. They greeted each other, introduced themselves, and for a few moments, they spoke of small things, the quiet of Shady Pines, the salty scent of the sea, the old house he had moved into. But Oliver's gaze was steady, lingering a little too long, as though he could see through the walls she had built around herself. As she walked back inside, she realized that Oliver's arrival had stirred something within her, something she hadn't felt in years. It was both thrilling and unsettling, a sense of being drawn toward a mystery she wasn't sure she was ready to unravel. The next day, Emily found herself standing at her kitchen counter, arranging a modest tea set with delicate cups and saucers she hadn't used in years. A part of her felt foolish. After all, she barely knew this man. But after years of loneliness and the silent chasms in her marriage, the prospect of a kind, listening ear was irresistible. When Oliver arrived at noon, he greeted her with a warm smile that held a strange familiarity. He seemed so comfortable, so at ease as he stepped into her dimly lit kitchen, carrying with him an air of mystery that only deepened her intrigue. They settled at the small wooden table by the window, the garden visible behind them, and over tea and cake, conversation began to flow. Their words started small, polite. The weather, the isolation of Shady Pines, the eerie quiet of her mansion on the hill. Yet as the minutes stretched into hours, their words turned deeper, drawing out the buried memories she hadn't touched in years. Oliver had an uncanny way of drawing her out. He would lean forward, listening with an intensity that was both comforting and disarming, his gaze never wavering. They spoke of childhood memories, the places they'd loved, and the people they'd lost along the way. And when Emily found herself mentioning her brother, her step-brother actually, who had disappeared when they were still children, Oliver's gaze sharpened, as though this was something he'd been waiting to hear. After Oliver left that evening, Emily felt an odd mix of emotions. A sense of comfort, yes, but also a lingering unease. Something about their conversation had stirred memories she thought she had long since buried. As night crept over Shady Pines, she found herself drawn to the attic, almost as if some invisible force was calling her. The attic was cold and dimly lit, the only illumination a faint beam of moonlight filtering through the dusty window. She hadn't ventured up here in years. The creaking floorboards and shadows gave it a forbidding air that kept her away. But tonight, something was different. She felt compelled to look, to sift through the remnants of her childhood in search of answers. She spotted an old box tucked away in a corner, half buried beneath a faded quilt. Pulling it toward her, she brushed off the dust and slowly opened the lid. Inside lay an assortment of keepsakes, crumpled photographs, old toys, and a small worn notebook with the initials J.H. scrawled on the front. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, flipping through pages filled with her stepbrother's familiar handwriting, thoughts and doodles from years ago. She could almost hear his voice, teasing her, guiding her. As she sifted through the memories, she found herself recalling her conversation with Oliver, how he'd known just the right things to say to soothe her. She felt a strange comfort in his presence, as if he had been sent to her in this moment of quiet desperation. And yet, there was something about him, something that seemed too perfect, too familiar. Days turned into a strange, comforting routine. Emily would rise early, her mornings stretching into afternoons with quiet anticipation, as if the hours themselves were holding their breath for the moments she would spend with Oliver. Their conversations grew deeper, each one peeling back another layer of Emily's past, of her hopes, her fears, and the secret burdens she carried. And Oliver always listened with that same intense, unwavering gaze. One morning, a week after they'd first met, Oliver invited her for a walk along the cliffs. The coastal breeze was cool, and the mist hung thick in the air, clinging to their coats as they strolled side by side. As they walked, she noticed Oliver had a way of steering their conversations back to her past. He would ask questions, soft, probing ones that made her feel safe enough to answer. When he gently asked about her family, she surprised herself by opening up. She spoke of her mother's remarriage when she was 6, of her stepbrother James, who had always been there for her, a quiet protector until the day he simply disappeared. She shared the ache of his absence, how it had haunted her all these years. Emily paused as she spoke, her voice catching as she recounted the loss of her stepbrother. She hadn't expected to reveal so much of herself, but something about Oliver's presence made it feel as though she could finally let go of the silence she had carried for so long. He listened, his silence understanding, his gaze never wavering. The connection between them seemed to deepen with every word, every shared memory. As they reached a secluded point overlooking the sea, Oliver stopped and turned to face her. Emily felt a shiver run through her, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the intensity of his gaze. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade into the background. The sea, the cliffs, the mist, all fell away, leaving only the two of them standing there, suspended in time. And in that moment, she felt a pull, a magnetism that she couldn't resist, as if the gravity between them had changed. Without a word, Oliver closed the distance between them. His hand reached for hers, and with a tenderness that took Emily's breath away, he kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both testing the waters of something new and dangerous. But as the moment stretched on, it deepened, and Emily felt a heat rise within her, an overwhelming wave of sensation that drowned out everything else. When they finally pulled away, neither spoke, but the air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Emily's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and longing. She had not expected this, hadn't even known she was ready for it. But now, in the aftermath of the kiss, she felt as if she had crossed a threshold she couldn't turn back from. The walls she had built around herself, the barriers she had erected to keep her past, and her pain, at a distance, all seemed to crumble in the face of Oliver's presence. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Emily found herself returning to the attic, drawn by an inexplicable need to confront the past. She carefully opened the old box she had found earlier, pulling out the photographs and keepsakes. One photograph in particular caught her eye, a picture of James, her stepbrother, taken a year before he vanished. She studied his face, the same serious eyes and strong jawline, and felt an unsettling jolt in her chest. His features seemed strangely familiar, almost identical to Oliver's. She couldn't shake the feeling that Oliver's presence in her life was more than just a coincidence. He had stirred memories, unearthed emotions she had long buried, and now there was this undeniable nagging sense that their connection went deeper than she could comprehend. Her stepbrother's disappearance, the mystery that had haunted her for so long, suddenly felt intertwined with the enigmatic figure of Oliver. But how and why? As Emily's thoughts spiraled, she found herself caught between the past and the present, between the warmth of Oliver's kiss and the shadows of the life she had left behind. Something in her was breaking, unraveling, and yet she couldn't bring herself to stop it. The days following the kiss had been a blur of longing, stolen moments, and fervent passion. It was as if a fire had ignited between Emily and Oliver, one that burned brightly, quickly, and imperceptibly, drawing them closer with every glance, every touch. Each kiss was more intense than the last, a silent promise that neither of them was willing to let go of. The connection between them deepened, wrapped in the warmth of shared secrets and the undeniable tension that simmered whenever they were near each other. Their encounters became more frequent, more reckless. It was as though time had a way of standing still when they were together, each moment suspended in a haze of desire and emotion. The attic, once a place of quiet memories, became their secret sanctuary. Emily would sneak up there, her pulse quickening with anticipation, where Oliver would be waiting. The dust of the old wooden floors, the faint smell of mothballs and old fabric, had somehow become a comforting reminder of the stolen time they shared. On Friday, September 22nd, the air outside was crisp, and the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and damp earth. Emily found herself walking through the house in a haze, her thoughts consumed by Oliver. She had spent the morning in the garden, gazing out at the sea, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her teacup. The moments they had shared the night before still lingered on her skin, like an electric charge. The memory of Oliver's lips, the way his hands had moved over her, the heat of his body pressed against hers, all of it played in her mind, over and over, as though her very existence had become a rhythm, pulsing with him. But the house felt different today. The silence felt oppressive, the stillness unsettling. And then, the sound of the front door creaking open below startled her from her reverie. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Richard. He'd come home early. She listened as his footsteps echoed through the hall, the heavy thud of his boots unmistakable. Richard was never home this early on Fridays. He often stayed late at the office or went out for drinks with colleagues, but today, he was here. And worse, he was upstairs. As panic surged through Emily as she glanced toward the attic door. Oliver had only just arrived, and they had not yet had time to be discreet. She quickly moved toward the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Richard was coming closer, his presence growing more undeniable with each passing second. Without thinking, Emily opened the attic door as quietly as she could and signaled to Oliver. He quickly rose from the old armchair in the corner, his face full of concern. He had heard the footsteps too, and his body tensed instinctively. Oliver didn't hesitate, slipping past her with the grace of someone accustomed to living in secrecy. He darted behind the stacks of old furniture and boxes out of sight. Emily closed the door softly behind him, her hands shaking. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out the sounds from downstairs. Richard's footsteps continued, growing louder as he approached the base of the stairs. The seconds felt like minutes. Emily stood frozen in place, praying he wouldn't come up here, praying he wouldn't notice the faint sounds of the attic door creaking or the disturbed air. She could hear Richard's muffled voice as he spoke to himself, unaware of the tension that hung in the air like an invisible thread between them. "Emily?" Richard's voice called up the stairs. "Where are you?" Emily quickly smoothed her clothes and cleared her throat, trying to sound as normal as possible. "I'm in the garden," she replied, her voice a little too high-pitched, betraying the fear that had begun to settle in her chest. There was a moment of silence before Richard's footsteps moved away from the stairs, heading toward the garden. Emily let out the breath she'd been holding, but it was short-lived. She knew that the moment was only temporary, and it would take just one wrong move for everything to come crashing down. She looked toward the attic door again, her pulse racing. Oliver was still hidden, silent in the shadows. Emily felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. The fire between them burned bright, but the world outside, the life she had built with Richard, was growing harder to escape. How long could they keep this secret? How long before Richard would notice the tension, the silence that had begun to hang between them? After what felt like an eternity, Emily finally heard Richard leave the garden and go toward the study. She cautiously opened the attic door, her heart still pounding in her chest. Oliver stood motionless, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity. Without a word, he stepped forward and cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. The kiss was gentle at first, but it quickly deepened, as if their very souls were reaching for one another, drawing them together in a world that was quickly becoming smaller and smaller. Emily could hear her own heart beating in her ears, the rush of blood to her head. Everything in her screamed to stop, to run, to get away from this dangerous, intoxicating affair, but she didn't. She stayed, lost in Oliver's embrace, as if he were the only thing that made sense in a world that was slowly unraveling. The days following the narrow escape from discovery became a tense game of silence and avoidance. Emily found herself increasingly drawn to Oliver, their connection growing deeper despite the risk. The presence of Richard, unaware or perhaps intentionally blind to the changes in their household, remained a constant tension in the air. Each glance, every moment of intimacy with Oliver, was an unspoken secret, and it became harder to pretend everything was normal. Emily began to feel the weight of her actions. The house, once a place of security, now felt like a cage, and each step she took echoed with the knowledge that everything was on the verge of unraveling. Oliver's presence in her life had shifted something inside her, something deeper than just a fleeting affair. She couldn't deny it. There was a connection, a comfort in him that Richard no longer provided. One afternoon, as the mist rolled in from the sea, Oliver appeared at the garden gate. His eyes met hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. They were too far gone to pretend. Without a word, they crossed the line between what was right and what felt undeniable, sharing a kiss that ignited something in them both, passion, desire, and the knowledge that there was no turning back. However, their stolen moment was cut short when they heard the sound of a car door slamming, followed by the unmistakable crunch of gravel. Richard had returned early. Panic set in as Emily fled toward the house, with Oliver close behind. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a battleground for secrets. Richard, ever perceptive, noticed the shift but said nothing, continuing his routine as if nothing had changed. Emily, however, could feel his suspicion growing. Her attempts to stay composed failed to mask the tension between them. That night, Emily found herself once again in the attic, seeking refuge in the dusty remnants of her past. She had uncovered memories of her lost stepbrother James, and now, in the hidden corners of the attic, a chest containing more letters addressed to her mother stirred up long-buried emotions. The name James appeared again, further deepening her sense of unease. The next morning, Richard came home earlier than expected. Their argument, a culmination of weeks of resentment, exploded in the house. The accusations, the blame, it was too much. Richard stormed off, and by the end of the day, he hadn't returned. Emily tried calling, leaving messages, but his absence left her with a gnawing feeling of dread. As the hours stretched on, worry began to consume her. When a full day passed with no word from Richard, she called the police. But before the phone call could connect, Oliver's words lingered in her mind. "I won't let anyone hurt you." His tone was unsettling, promising protection, but in a way that made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that Richard's disappearance wasn't a mere coincidence. Oliver's reassurance only made her feel more trapped. She realized then that whatever had happened to Richard, she might not be as innocent as she once thought. The search for Richard dragged on, but there was no sign of him. The police were skeptical, but Emily couldn't help feeling that something darker was at play. Each passing day, she tried to keep up appearances, but the unease gnawed at her, and Oliver was always there, lingering in the background like a shadow she couldn't escape. His comforting presence, though alluring, also felt suffocating, as though he had already taken hold of everything around her without her even realizing it. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, reminding her of the terrible secret she was trying to bury. She avoided the attic as much as possible, but the memories of James, her long-lost stepbrother, still haunted her. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces of her past seemed to fit together in disturbing ways she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. Oliver, however, remained steadfast in his devotion. Every time she looked at him, she was torn between a sense of safety and the unsettling feeling that she was being manipulated, drawn into something from which there was no escape. He had become her anchor in the storm, but she could sense that the storm itself might be of his making. One night, unable to sleep, Emily ventured out to the garden. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the fog that had rolled in from the sea. She walked toward the boundary of her property, where the fence separated her home from Oliver's. As if on cue, Oliver appeared in the garden, his figure emerging from the mist. His eyes, dark and intense, met hers. She didn't speak at first, but the tension between them was palpable, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Oliver reached out, his touch like fire against her skin. Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. It was like being pulled into the eye of a storm, everything around her fading, leaving only him. She let herself be consumed by the moment, not thinking, just feeling. And then, as if in slow motion, he kissed her. The kiss was all-encompassing, igniting something within her that she couldn't deny. But even as she kissed him back, a part of her felt something stirred deep inside, a growing sense of dread that perhaps she had already lost control. She knew she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't fully comprehend. The lines between love and manipulation were blurring, and she wasn't sure which side she was on anymore. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance snapped them both out of their reverie. Richard's car? The possibility of him returning so soon set Emily's heart racing. She broke away from Oliver, her pulse pounding in her ears. She looked at him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, fear and desire mixing in a dangerous dance. Oliver's expression remained unreadable, though there was a glint in his eyes, a hint of something dark that she couldn't quite place. He stepped back, allowing her space to breathe. "I won't let him come back," Oliver said quietly, almost too calmly. "Not now. Not after everything that's happened." Emily froze, the words sinking into her like ice. She knew now that she had crossed a line, and whatever had happened to Richard, it was no longer just a disappearance. It was something far more sinister, and Oliver was the key to it all. As the tension between them grew, Emily realized that her world had shifted. She was no longer sure where the truth ended and the lies began. What had started as a fleeting connection had become something far more dangerous, and she couldn't see a way out. The fog thickened and Emily's fear deepened. The days bled into one another, each one more suffocating than the last. Emily felt trapped, as if she were caught in a web spun of her own making, unable to break free from the increasingly tangled threads of her life. The disappearance of Richard had consumed her, and with it, the growing realization that Oliver was not the man she had once believed him to be. He wasn't just a comforting presence. He was a force in her life, pulling her deeper into a world of shadows and half-truths. As the days stretched on with no word from Richard, the police grew more frustrated. Emily had to play her part, feigning concern while knowing in the back of her mind that her life had already begun to unravel in ways she couldn't understand. She had confessed to Oliver her darkest memories, her troubled past, everything she had tried to bury, only for him to know her better than anyone ever had. But she never told him about the box in the attic, the letters, the unsettling memories of her stepbrother James that had started to resurface. One evening, while she wandered through the house, Oliver approached her, his presence as consuming as ever. His eyes were dark, too dark, and the intensity of his gaze made her shiver. There was no escaping him now. She was tied to him, willingly or not. "I told you I would protect you," he whispered, as he took her hand. His grip was firm, unyielding. "I won't let anything happen to you." Emily wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the words echoed in her mind, the way he had said them before, too calmly, too deliberately. She tried to push aside the nagging doubt, but it grew louder with each passing moment. Then, it happened. Richard's body was found in the woods near the edge of their property. The police ruled it an accident at first, but Emily knew better. The manner of his death, brutal, deliberate, left little room for doubt. She stared at the report in disbelief, her hands trembling as she realized what had happened. Oliver was right there beside her, as if he had been expecting it all along. His silence spoke volumes. "I told you I wouldn't let anyone hurt you," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Now you're free." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the room closing in on her. She tried to speak, but her throat felt tight, words failing her. She had seen enough, heard enough to know the truth. Oliver hadn't just protected her, he had orchestrated Richard's death. He had become the man he'd promised to be, but at a cost Emily hadn't fully understood until now. As the realization sank in, she knew there was no turning back. Richard was gone, and in his place there was nothing but the chilling certainty that she was now entangled in a nightmare she had helped create. The passion, the desire, everything that had once felt like freedom, had led her down a dark path from which there was no escape. The fog outside thickened, the shadows growing deeper, and Emily realized she was no longer just a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. She was something else entirely, a prisoner in her own home, a pawn in Oliver's game, and the attic, where the remnants of her past were buried, would hold the final answers.